So I want to show you something cool about causal identification. So for those of you who don't know, that's a real technical term about thinking about all of the single relationships that we have on Earth, and that there's supposed to be one single relationship. I'm actually out walking my dogs right now, and I passed this to give you a feeling of causal identification, where I think it's actually a little bit more complicated than having a single relationship between two things. We often think about an independent variable and a dependent variable, and those are somehow related in nature. How are you?
How you doing?
Good. And they're somehow related in nature, where we have two things that correlate with each other. I want to actually show you what real nature looks like and what things actually look like in the real world. And this tells me that causal identification may not be necessarily the best thing to look at always. And we have to accept that there's sometimes a lot of complexity in nature. Take a look at this. This is a bush just outside of my house. And look at all the relationships that actually exist. Right? There's all these intertwined relationships that look like they exist. They are going in all sorts of different directions. There's vines all over the place. Take a look at up here. I'm gonna walk a little further, and there's all these crazy vines that are going in all sorts of different directions. Now, the idea behind causal identification is that there is a very simple relationship that exists between two different things. And yes, under some circumstances, that might be the truth. And looking at that, you might be able to come up with some sort of calculation to identify the causal nature of all of these different directions. But to be honest, much of nature is very complicated. And you don't know where one thing begins and the other one stops, and that is totally fine. I think the idea of the simplified nature of causal identification, well, it's beautiful mathematically and from a computation perspective and from a scientific perspective, where we're trying to study things, where we try to come up with one single relationship and how it relates to everything else. It doesn't work like that. When you look at all these different bushes, what's happening is that there is, maybe it's competition, maybe it's other things that are going on, but where there's a space, another vine will creep in and fill that particular space. Now, is that an easy thing to model? Is that an easy thing to predict? Absolutely not. That is extremely hard to do. And I think we could do that in a very complicated model, mathematical model that might predict some of that, but to predict it exactly as it is right now and how it looks is next to impossible. And that is one little tiny area of nature, one little tiny area of the world that is extremely small, and all parts of nature are that way. There is so much complexity. I'm going to come back to this idea of causal identification, where you have a single relationship, and that single relationship, you can identify all of the different reasons and factors, all that kind of stuff that's going on. That's going to be impossible in that circumstance, because there's a different breeze that comes along. There's different rain patterns. There's all sorts of differences that happen. And so, yes, I'm not saying to throw up your hands and say, we can't understand nature. What I'm saying is nature is far more complicated than we often allude to. And I think we have to take a step back and say, wait a minute, we're only explaining a fraction of nature at any given moment. And causal identification is a beautiful thing. It allows us to see the world in a more interesting way, but at the same time, don't tell anybody, but my neighbor's putting these up on the nature trail. They see the little wooden birds. So causal identification simplifies things so much that I think you're often forgetting about the complexity of the world. And I think there's always room for people that want to understand and talk about just the sheer mess of everything And that goes for looking at bramblebushes, that's what I would call them, or the bush, or looking at the nature of how humans relate, looking at rocks, looking at how organizations and businesses relate, all these kind of things. It's far more complicated than we're ever going to give it credit to. And I think we really need to start saying the world's beautifully complex, and we will never ever be able to understand all of this complexity, and that's okay. That's a beautiful thing. That doesn't mean that you have to stop trying to understand everything and getting better causal identification, but it means let's recognize our weaknesses.